Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to do a review of a review copy of Captain C, the 2021 war game from Legion Wargames covering combat in the Age of Sail. Designed by Mike Nagel, this game specifically focuses on combat involving the U.S. frigates between the years 1799 and 1815. Let's jump in and get started with our power review. I've really enjoyed playing this game. I feel like it captures the flavor and the essence of ship-to-ship combat in this time period. You've got all the mechanics and they're executed in a combat and maneuver system that's very tight and it just works seamlessly to recreate these battles. So you've got grappling, melee, broadsides, hull damage, rigging damage, crew damage. You've got maneuverability and wind gauge, and it's a very elegant and finely tuned system that really works to create these battles well, and it's fun to play. Now, I will say, it did take me longer than I expected to learn the game because I feel like the rulebook could have used another pass. Also, as good as the mechanics are, I think it feels like in a couple places they could be tweaked or refined a little bit more to bring them from that very good level to an outstanding superb level. Lastly, the firing mechanic took me quite a while to learn, and it takes it quite a while to implement in the game. And I wonder if streamlining that mechanic could improve the overall experience. 1.2, about the nature of these engagements. Historically, some of these engagements were fairly one-sided, and that plays out in the game as well. Now, there is a victory point mechanic to offset that. However, one of the really cool things about this game is how easy it is to create hypothetical engagements where you can create a finely tuned and finely balanced two-player experience. Now let's jump into the meaty review. So let's jump into our meaty review. Now, I feel like this meaty review is going to be a meaty review that might be somewhat lengthy because I think there's a lot to say about this game. And I've been digging into it now for about a week and a half. I've probably got about maybe 12 to 15 hours with it so far, learning the game, playing out a number of engagement, testing it solitaire and two-player. And I've really enjoyed my time with it. I think that's probably the best place to start. I mean, big picture, step back picture. Would I recommend this game? Is it a fun game to play? And I would unequivocally say yes. I think you've got all of the key mechanics here, the combat and the maneuvering with the wind and the way the sailing mechanic works and some of the unique mechanics around activation cycles and things like that. They just fit with this type of combat. And one of the things I like to ask myself with a game is like, does it put yourself in that situation? And does it tell the story of what it was like then? And I feel like with the game at this tactical level, you know, the ship-to-ship level, you know, when you're done with it, you feel like you were there. And when you land a broadside on your opponent and you can see like their hull cave in on one side and you get like 3 hits on the front, the stern, and the port and stuff like that, on the stern and the bow and everything, and you just see their rigging start to go and their crew gets hit and they get a morale check and the ship gets set on fire, you're like, damn, that's cool. You know, when you level a ship like that with a really good broadside. And then sometimes you can miss and you can have this maneuver that just puts the ship out of range, or it's covered by smoke and you can't get a good shot off and things like that. So the decisions, the intricacy, the thinking that goes involved with this ship-to-ship combat, I feel like all of that is there, and there's obviously been a ton of time put into this system to recreate that experience. And one of the things I want to mention too is that, and I mentioned this in the unboxing, but I'm going to pull this up here too, 6 Frigates by Ian Toll. So I was reading this and I'm about almost done with it, and then I got Captain C came in. And so as I got to this book, in this point in the book, there was a battle, the Chesapeake versus the Shannon. And all of the major engagements of these U.S. frigates that were in this time period, 1799 to 1815, which involved really kind of the creation of 6 frigates in the United States that were rather innovative and really kind of restructured and defined some of the combat of this era. So I just read in the book, you know, a number of pages about the Chesapeake versus the Shannon and what that encounter was like. And sure enough, it's one of the 10 scenarios in the game that you can play. So I'm like, oh, cool, let's play that. You know, then I read it and then I played it and I got to the end of playing through it. And it's like, I can see exactly why the Chesapeake lost. You know, the Chesapeake basically had a green crew and the Shannon had perhaps one of the best crews, if not the best crew in the British Navy at that point in time. Just highly honed, well-trained, drilled by an impressive captain who led them. And the Shannon beat the Chesapeake, of course, in real, and that's the same that happened in the game. And you could see the challenges that the Chesapeake had with this green crew, just trying to take advantage, get shots off. They can't get shots off. All these kinds of little intricacies that come into play, because really the only defining difference between these two ships in that engagement was the crew quality. Such a vast gap between that, but it played such a huge role in the historical engagement when you read about it, and it plays such a huge role in the game. And so you feel like, when I was playing that and I got through, it's like I feel like I played the history of that engagement. And it was such a neat gaming movement to go from reading about it to playing it and to seeing how those two things matched up, that is like, wow, this did such a good job of recreating that battle. If you're a student of this time period in history and you just like this age and sail, and if you've read Six Frigates, or even if you haven't read Six Frigates and you like this time period, this is like a perfect combination. Just put it on your holiday list and say, get me both of these things. And I don't get any kudos, I don't get any bonuses for promoting either one of these things or the other, but Six Frigates is an awesome book and they go together so well. I mean, if you like playing a game and reading a book at the same time, just get the two and you're going to be perfectly happy. So those are the positives. The mechanics, the maneuvering, the guessing and stuff like that, I think is really, really good. I have had a lot of fun playing it so far. I've played a number of engagements and I want to play more. So big picture step back, I'm having a very positive experience with it and I'm enjoying my time with the game, and I really admire the system and all the work and creativity that's gone into it. So let's say that. Now, I should also qualify. Let me qualify too, because this is probably important if you're thinking about, is this something for me? This is a two-player game at heart, right? And I think that's where it really shines. The maneuvering and kind of outguessing each other, those components, you lose some of that in a solitaire mode. Having said that, I would definitely not try it 3-player. The game, it mentions it's not designed for 3-player, although there are some portions in the rules that say this is how you could do it if you wanted to try it 3-player. And one of the scenarios does have a 3-player option. I would stay away from that. I feel like it's intricate and it's detailed enough that adding another layer of detail to try to make it work for 3 ships when it's designed for 2 would be hard. I wouldn't be interested in doing that. I think you're pushing the system beyond really what it's designed for. And I'll mention a little bit why that happens as I talk about a couple of other things as we get into the game here too. So that being said, now solitaire, the game, I think it does kind of say it's not necessarily designed for solitaire, and I feel like the thinking would be that it loses quite a bit when you're talking about the maneuvering element and trying to outguess your opponent which way they're going to go. I can say that as playing it solitaire, I've played a number of engagements solitaire now, I've found that it works great solitaire. And part of it is, I think, because I think it's the maneuvering might be a little easy to get right consistently. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about a couple other things that I've noticed with the game. So I haven't found the game to really lose that much as a solitaire game. I've found that playing out these engagements are historical, and sometimes you have to say, well, okay, the ship could do that or could do this, and maybe I'll roll a die to determine which way it goes and stuff like that. So it does lose a little bit with the maneuvering in the solitaire mode, but I find it's eminently playable and enjoyable as a solitaire experience. So that's something probably that needs to be said. So let's go on now, and I want to talk a couple of things, though. It's not all positives and happy, unfortunately. And no game is perfect, right? So let's kind of get that out of the way. But I do have a few things to say in terms of that, kind of talking a little bit about some of the negatives that I experienced with it. Now, so I've been back wargaming now for about 8 months. And over the course of these 8 months, I've learned about 2 to 3 games per month as I've come back into the field, varying complexity and stuff like that. I have to say, I hate to say it, but I felt like this was the most challenging game I've learned so far. And it's got a 16-page rule book, so it's not really complex. I think there are 2 reasons that led to it. One is that I think the rules could have used another editing pass before they came to press. I'm just going to put it out there and say it. There are some places where there's some ambiguous terms. For example, one is the cards and the player's aids, and 1 or 2 places in the rules refers to something called crew status. But there's no crew status in the game. There's crew morale and crew quality. So when you run into crew status, status, you think, is it crew quality? Is it crew morale? I don't know, right? So it creates this kind of friction in trying to figure out what really is the intent of the rules. There's some places where the information on the player aids conflict with the information in the rule book. The information on the map and the various elements around the map conflict with the rule book. So some of the numbers are different. So just kind of, those things create friction in the learning experience, and they make it a little bit challenging to figure out what's going on. The other element that I think could use some improvement in the rules, one of the things I do in the real world is I design and build online learning experiences for students, courses for students. And so the conversations that we have, two of the elements that we consider when we do that is what's called the learning pathway. So it's not just enough to have the information out there for a student to learn. You also have to think about the pathway and what their experience is going to be like as they work through this linear process of working from one thing to another and learn your course or your material. And I feel like in a couple places that learning pathway made it challenging for me to kind of figure out what was going on. And one place in particular that stood out to me was when I was trying to learn about firing range, it talks about firing range being 24 movement points. And that seems clear enough, except in the early part of the rules, the learning pathway the early part of the section of the rule talks about how movement points are this relative value, so that if two ships are moving in the same direction with the same wind, that their movement points are going to be 0. So I had that in my head, and then movement points are converted to action points in the next section of the rule. So I kind of forgot about movement points, because then you use activations to maneuver the ship. And so I was really kind of lost as to what it meant to maneuver movement points. Now, it's spelled out in a section of the rules under advanced, but those sections of the rules are also kind of duplicated on the map, and I had looked at the version that was on the map, so I completely missed it. Now, part of that's probably on me, for sure, but I've seen another couple other people on Board Game Geek posting the same thing, so I felt like there's some places like that where the learning experience the learning pathway could have been thought through and elaborated and articulated a little bit better. Likewise, I've also found it a little bit challenging to go back into the rule book and find sections on the rules. Like, I think some of the rules could be cross-referenced a little bit better, so that if you're looking in one place for something and you can't find it, it's going to point you back to that section. There's some places like where it talks about making a morale check. It'd be nice to have a reference back there, but instead you kind of have to go find it again. And I found those things kind of slowed it down. And the combat and the maneuvering is new and novel enough and cool enough that it would have been easier for me to learn, I think, had those experiences been a little bit better. So that's enough on that, I think. And again, no game is perfect. You're not talking about hundreds of rules and stuff like that, but it did make learning of the game a little bit more challenging. Now, in defense, I want to say one thing. Mike Nagel, the game designer, has been on Board Game Geek every day, patiently and calmly answering questions and come up about the rules. I've posted a number of questions. A few other people have posted questions. And if you're going to go in and try to learn the game now, I think if you can cross-reference with the answers there that are on Board Game Geek, your experience is going to be a lot easier. I think if I had started learning the game now, I could go to Board Game Geek and find any of the answers to my questions, because he's done such a great job at coming in and supporting the game after its release, providing clear answers, providing explanations, and providing a lot of information about what some of the ambiguous points in the rules might be or something like that. He's been super patient, and it's great to see that. So as a learner of a game, what I feel like is the frustrating place to get, right, is when you're trying to learn a game and you just get stuck and you've got no answer. It's a completely different experience when you get stuck and you can post a question and you can check the next day and now you're unstuck and there's a great answer. So yeah, would it have been better if the rules were a little bit more conducive to helping someone completely new to the system learn the game? Yes, I think so. But kudos to the designer for stepping up and answering all the questions and going through and being really patient and supportive with the game after release. Because now I feel like I've really got the rules down. I'm playing it and I'm enjoying it. Took a little bit longer than I thought, but I'm there, so it's all good and well. Now, so a second thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is an observation I've had so far. And I mentioned how much I like the combat and how much fun it is to play and to kind of recreate these battles. So that's a given. So I want to kind of make sure we keep that in perspective as I talk about this point here. Having said that, I feel like in some places the mechanics are 95% of the way there. And what right now is currently a very good system could use maybe another iteration of tweaking to make it into an absolutely amazing system. Two places I'd like to talk a little bit about. One is with regards to the balance between maneuverability, rigging damage, hull damage, and aiming high or aiming low. So in simplest terms, you can aim high to try to reduce the ship's sailing capacity, maneuvering capacity, by tearing apart the sails and demasting it. Or you can aim low to try to sink the ship and reduce its capacity to fire by hitting the hull, right? And the way rigging damage works right now is there's basically 3 stages. So you've got like 14 rigging points, say, on a typical ship. And when it's at 8 to 14 points, you can be at full sail, which is full maneuverability. Once you get to half of that, roughly half, your ship is reduced to the most it can be at is fighting sail, which is basically your movement points are going to be divided by 2. So you've got 1 stage, 2 stage, and then if it goes all the way down to 0, you're basically demasted, your movement points are reduced by 4, and you're kind of just a lumbering hulk in the water and you can't really maneuver at all. Well, you can go to fighting sail by option, and that would basically reduce your rigging damage by half, and you can choose to go at fighting sail, or you can stay at full sail. But your rigging can also get damaged to the point where your only option is fighting sail. So what I've found, though, is that if I'm aiming at rigging, it takes a while to get down through that stage of being at full sail down to fighting sail. And even when I'm at fighting sail, I've found I'm able to maneuver my ship in a way that I can still get off broadsides at the enemy. Like I've got enough maneuverability left that I can almost always, not always, but almost always get off an effective broadside at the enemy ship. So it feels like the damage to rigging, let me say it simply, I win when I aim low. When I aim at the hull, I win. When I aim at the rigging, I lose. And basically what happens when you aim low, if you do hull damage, you get an equivalent amount, roughly an equivalent amount of cannon damage. So you get immediate impact and benefit by hitting the hull, because you're going to reduce the number of cannons that can return fire at you in subsequent rounds. So aiming low and pounding the hull reduces the enemy firepower right away. Aiming high is going to eventually reduce maneuverability, but the reduction in maneuverability doesn't really seem to hinder my ship's ability to set up a broadside. So I feel like I'm better off in almost all cases. So far, when I aim low, I win. When I aim high, I lose. So I feel like this, it's a cool system. You got hull damage, you got rigging damage, you got crew damage and stuff like that. But as a tactical engagement, I'm finding it seems to pay off to aim low. And maybe that's just me. Maybe I have to play a little bit more to kind of understand the subtleties of the maneuvering and the rigging damage. But so far, that's kind of an intuition. It's like, wow, I feel like aiming low makes sense. So that's a place where I feel like, could that be tweaked a little bit? Or does it even need to be tweaked? And it kind of leaves me thinking, maybe there's some places this could be kind of improved or modified a little bit. The second place I know that, and this one I'm a little bit more confident on speaking, is as the game was published and the way the rules came out, if you looked at the math behind firing round shot or firing chain shot. And so basically chain shot was this kind of ball on a chain that was designed to rip apart the rigging and the sails. A round shot's designed to kind of do general damage. In particular, you could do more hull damage, but general kind of generic damage, whereas chain shot is designed to rip apart the rigging, right? The way the game rules were published and the way the game was put out, it always made sense to fire round shot to do more rigging, to do as much or more rigging damage than chain shot. So chain shot just didn't make sense mathematically to fire. So then the designer made a modification to it now that increases the effectiveness of chain shot. But what it's also done right now is it's increased the effectiveness of chain shot at long range. And historically, kind of looking at this, I was kind of wondering about that, so I was reading a little bit about tonight. Historically, chain shot wasn't effective at long range. So, it's kind of this situation where I feel like, as I've played a number of times, it's like, wow, I feel like chain shot could have been a little bit more thought out, and it still needs a little bit refinement. And so that's like 2 places. That's really the only places I've run into it so far. But they do make me feel a little bit like, wow, things just could be refined or tweaked a little bit more, and you're going to take this incredibly positive experience and raise it up a whole nother level. And so I feel like there might be a little bit of room for another iteration in the game mechanics. Let's talk a little bit about a third thing that I've experienced as I've been playing the game. So it's about the firing sequence. Now the firing sequence is fairly intricate, and this connects a little bit back to point number 1. So I've got 14 steps process. And I found that it just was taking me a long time to kind of execute this sequence, longer than I felt like it should. And part of the reason why was that as I was trying to get through this sequence, this procedure to fire broadsides, I was having to refer back to the rule book, and it's spelled out over a couple of pages, but yet some of the numbers you need are on different places in the rules. So I found like I was bouncing back and forth and like, is this crew morale? Is this crew quality? What goes here? What's the modifier there? How do I do that morale check? And so I'm kind of bouncing back and forth, and it was pretty intricate. So what I did was I found like that was slowing me down a lot, like more than it should have. So I went through and I just created this little 14-step process that had just what I needed to know, no extra words, and then the modifiers, like all the dice roll modifiers. And I found that once I made this, I was able to significantly accelerate my learning of the firing sequence and get up to speed quickly. So my main point is that I felt like it's taken me longer than it should to get up to speed with a fairly intricate sequence. That's kind of the heart of the game. And it's detailed, and it's got a good amount of detail. I'm not necessarily kind of bringing any criticism against that sequence, but I felt like it was really challenging for me to get fast and efficient that sequence, partly because it would have been really nice to have a playing aid like this in the game. Now, there is, of course, a combat firing sequence. Here, I'll just reach across and grab this in the player aids, but it doesn't have the numbers I need. And then the rule book, sometimes the numbers are someplace else. So I felt like this would have been really nice to have. And at the same time, I do wonder, having gone through this, I mean, there's a number of stages here. I'll just kind of go through. The first is you have to identify which sections are going to fire on your ship, you have to determine the range, you have to determine rake status, which is usually pretty easy. Then you're going to say whether you're going to aim high or low. Then you're going to determine the hit dice. Then you're going to roll the dice to determine the hits, and there's some die roll modifiers. Then you determine defensive dice. Then you roll the defensive dice, and there's some modifiers there depend on the type of target and some of the other range kind of elements. Then you're going to check for damage effects, which is kind of look up. Then you're going to adjust for the hits based on a few other things. Then it could be a morale check that spins out of that. There could be a morale check that comes from damage as it happens too. Then you're going to check to see if the ship went on fire. Then you're going to apply smoke and reload. So that's a lot, right? Now, a lot of these steps are super fast, right? So it's like it sounds like I'm being really critical, but I'm not. There's a lot of these steps are super quick and you get through them. But there's enough there that I felt like I needed more support than the game provided to learning it. And it took me longer than it should have for me to really get up to speed with this. With the help of this page that I created, I feel like things are moving along really quickly now, but it was pretty intricate and kind of a challenging experience to get up to speed with that as I was going along. Having said that, I found myself wondering as I've been playing this, like, could this firing sequence be streamlined and simplified a little bit, yet keep the same level of detail to match the rest of the combat system, so that the playing time of the scenarios could be reduced a little bit and they wouldn't quite take so much time to process? Because it's taking me about 45 minutes to an hour and a half to play through these, and I'm sure I'll get faster as I play more. But at the same time, it feels like there's quite a bit to do when firing a broadside. And I feel like ultimately this would be the perfect experience at a half an hour to 60 minutes. And perhaps if that firing sequence could get simplified a bit and yet not lose any of its detail and its elegant detail for recreating that this could be a little bit sharper experience. The last thing I'd like to say, and this isn't aimed as this is more an observation than anything else. There's a number of engagements in the book, right? And the designer mentions this too. Historically, these are all historical engagements, for the most part, historical engagements that actually happened, except involving the Congress, which actually was one of the 6 U.S. frigates that really didn't get a chance to fight in any of these engagements. So the designers put in kind of a couple of what-if scenarios that could have happened to involve that ship. But these are all historical engagements that happened in the course of the Quasi-War versus France or the War of 1812. Now, the thing about a lot of these engagements is that they're accurately recreated in the game, which is really cool. But unfortunately, a lot of these are kind of one-sided affairs. Like the Java versus the Constitution. I mean, if you're the Java, good luck, man. You just got like no chance. Likewise, Chesapeake versus Shannon. It's like, no, unless the Chesapeake gets off a really good shot and reduces the Shannon's morale, which, by the way, superpower tip that I've found so far, you can play these cards to increase any die roll. I've found that playing them to increase your morale check roll is a really good use because you do not want to lose morale. There's no way to get it back, and it impacts your firing accuracy. And once that starts to go south, everything goes south fast. So anyway, the Chesapeake, that's kind of a side point, but the Chesapeake I think could beat the Shannon if it gets off a really lucky roll, but it's almost like the Shannon has to make a mistake to lose, kind of maneuverability mistake. And for the most part, the Shannon's really going to beat the Chesapeake all the time, which means that if you're playing this two-player, one person's going to get beat, right? And now there is a modifier in the game that says, okay, we're going to have a victory point modifier that's going to give the weaker ship more victory points per amount of damage to equal out the thing. But still, it's kind of like an analogy that I think of is if you're Norwich City in the Premier League and you're playing like Manchester City or Liverpool, it's like losing 2-0 instead of losing 5-0. You still got pounded, right? You still really didn't do much and your ship got beat. So as a two-player experience, I've found that kind of playing that weaker ship in some of these scenarios really isn't all that much fun. But, and here's the big but, that's probably not the best way to put that, but here is the element of it. It's really easy in the game to create hypothetical situations. Like if you want to match the Chesapeake up against the Shannon and make it an equal encounter, just bump the crew quality from the Chesapeake from green up to crack. Now you've got two ships that are relatively equal and you've got a really cool two-player engagement. So I'd highly encourage, if you're playing this two-player, to kind of shift some of those hypotheticals around to create two ships that are evenly matched, because otherwise you're going to run into a number of situations where it's just really hard for one to fight against the other. Now, some of these are engaged. I just was doing the Endymion versus the President, and that's pretty cool. I found that pretty even, and I just won with the President, which is ahistorical, but that's a pretty even encounter and things like that. So they're not all like that, but there's a number of them that are pretty one-sided affairs that you might want to balance out. So, the final word. Would I recommend the game? Yes, I'd recommend the game, and I also recommend the book. And again, I don't get anything for recommending either of these things, but this is a cool one-two experience. I recommend the game. This game does a great job at recreating these battles. They're easy to modify for a balanced two-player experience. You feel like you're there, and I mentioned it earlier on, but when you land the big broadside and you just rip apart your opponent's ship, it's like the coolest feeling ever. You're like, yeah, deal with that. I mean, it's just cool. And I feel like it's so historically accurate in terms of how they've created the advantages and disadvantages. Like when I went back and just reading about some of these encounters and then getting a chance to play them in the game, it is so cool. You feel like you're there. The game tells the story. It's got all of the elements, the smoke and the crew loss and melee and grappling and stuff like that. I mean, just a really fun system that does a wonderful job at recreating these battles, and it's just entertaining to play, and it's just historically there. So this is a keeper. I can see myself coming back to it. I like this period in history, and I've learned a lot by playing the game and reading the book at the same time, and I've had a lot of fun playing it. Now, the qualifiers there with the rule book, yeah, I think it's already an easier experience because you can go right to Board Game Geek now and find the answers that going through it as early as I did. With the experience, the answers weren't there yet. It's much easier now to go through because you can look at the answers. I'm sure the rules are going to get updated. The mechanics right now are very good. They're very crisp and very clear, and they represent battle as it happened. My comments on could they be tweaked a little bit are just kind of observations on the fringes more than they are core to the game experience. You can still get at the essence of this combat very well with the system as it is right now, and that my thinking may even evolve on that as I play it a lot more. And I did mention, of course, that the firing sequence, I wonder if that could be streamlined a little bit to shorten play and to streamline the whole combat experience a little bit. I think there's some potential there for improvement to the experience as well. But again, on the whole, I've had a very positive experience with this game. I love the cards for the uniqueness. I love the ship mats, the complexity, and the elegance with which all of these mechanics just weave together to recreate this experience. You can taste the history when you're playing this, and it's just a fun experience. So I recommend this game. It's a keeper for me, and I'm sure I will come back to it because it's just, sometimes you feel like just blowing ships up. It's just fun. It's just a cool game to play. So I'm very happy I've got it, and I'm enjoying the experience with it a lot. And that brings us, I think, to the end. A rather lengthy and meaty review indeed. I hope you've enjoyed it. I haven't rambled on too much. If you have enjoyed it, thumbs up are greatly appreciated because that will help get the video in front of more people. And if you're new, about 50% of the content on the channel is historical gaming and wargaming content. So please, if you would love to subscribe, would love to have you aboard for the ride as well. well. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, have you played the game? Things I might be able to answer that wouldn't be available on Board Game Geek, or just if you'd like to ask them in general. If you've played it, how are you enjoying it and things like that? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the review and on the game if you had a chance to experience it at all. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed it, and have a great day and happy gaming.